Just let me know when you're ready on that PowerPoint.
We're good.
Okay. It's not coming over. There it goes. All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to talk about the fossil record this evening. And before we get into some of the details that are provided for this lesson, I want to cover a few things that we know scripturally about what God had done when He sent the flood on this earth and what had happened in sending that flood. I want to begin there this evening before we get into the details of this lesson, so we have a basis of where to start from, but also a basis of where to end on this lesson this evening. So let's go to a few verses in the book of Genesis for a moment. Genesis chapter 7, let's start with. And Genesis chapter 7 tells us about the great flood that existed on this earth that God sent forth, in which the heavens opened up, the ground beneath had broken apart, the waters below and the waters above all came down and filled the earth. And they didn't just fill the earth, there was a result of the filling of the earth with water, and that is everything that had breath, everything that lived on the earth died consequently because of the flood. And Genesis actually tells us multiple times that everything died. It's like God's telling us, I don't want to just tell you one time, I want you to know multiple times that everything died, everything that lived, and that includes everything. It leaves nothing out. I can't emphasize that anymore. In Genesis 7 and verse 21, it says, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beast, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man." Notice that as it describes who passed, who died on the earth, it says everything, but then it details everything. And it says everything includes birds, everything includes cattle, everything includes beasts, and everything includes creeping things. A lot of people ask the question, well, what about bugs? And what about fish life and bird life and fowl kind? Everything. The word creeping thing there is a Hebrew word. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correct, but shiretz, a Hebrew word meaning a swarm. Now we know what usually travels in swarms, don't we? Usually they're bugs of some sort, creeping things on this earth. It's referring to a mass of minute animals, very small creatures, a mass of them. Ants are small animals. They would have passed. Every creeping thing that God had made perished on this earth. Go to Genesis chapter 6 and look at verse 7. Genesis 6 and verse 7 says, "So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." Now, it says creeping thing in English. Sounds like it's the same thing. Actually, it's a different Hebrew word for creeping thing there, remes, meaning a reptile or other rapidly moving animal that creeps. So referring to smaller animals in the reptilian kind, but a creeping thing. We know there are a lot of small reptilians out there, and yet as the Scriptures define for us some great detail about it's not just man that passed from this earth, it's not just larger animals that passed from this earth, it's everything, small masses and swarms and rapidly moving animals. I know there's very small insects that rapidly move. It's hard to catch a fly, isn't it? It's hard to catch some quick spiders, isn't it? Creeping things exist on this earth, and they all died in the flood. Genesis 6 and verse 17, as God tells Noah that he is going to bring a flood onto this earth, it says in verse 17, "And behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die." Notice how detailed there it is in verse 17. Everything on the earth shall die. That is, everything that has a life within it, a breath that exists within it. And we know that animals, we know that insects all have a type of life. They don't have the same spirit as we do as humans, but they have a type of life that God had given them that breathed, that they were able to function on this earth and live. but they're all going to die in this flood. I want you to notice in Job chapter 22 quickly. Job chapter 22. And in this part of Job, we see one of Job's friends here who's actually trying to tell Job that he has done something wrong and accuses him of wickedness. But even those who speak falsely about God, and in this case falsely about Job and his righteousness, can acknowledge the truth. And they acknowledged a truth here, and that is, his friend said in Job 22 and verse 17, they say to God, depart from us. What can the Almighty do to them? Yet he filled their, back up to verse 16, who were cut down before their time, whose foundations were swept away by a flood. This is widely acknowledged across this entire world. Every culture that we have seen historically acknowledges a great global or widespread flood. Every one of them. In our historical understanding of people and their civilizations, they acknowledge that a flood existed. And here Job's friend acknowledged a flood. The reason why I said we know these things that they say about Job and about God are wrong, it doesn't mean that just because that God acknowledges what they said about him was wrong, that everything that somebody says is wrong means that everything will be wrong. Did that make any sense? I hope so. But anyway, they acknowledged the flood. Even though they weren't acknowledging the truth of God, they were still acknowledging a flood that existed. Go back to Genesis chapter 7 one more time. I want to highlight verse 23 this time of Genesis chapter 7. Genesis 7 and verse 23, as it kind of concludes this matter of the flood coming on the earth and what happened to all of the living creatures on this earth, every living being that had breath. It says in verse 23, so he, that is God, destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing, and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. Now remember what we are taught in 2 Peter chapter 2 and also 1 Peter chapter 3, that Noah prepared an ark in the saving of himself and his family. There were 8 souls that were with him. But that acknowledges the humankind that existed on the ark. Genesis 7 verse 23 acknowledges all kinds that were on the ark. Read it again, please. So he destroyed all, that leaves nothing out, living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing, and bird of the air. Now highlight this next point. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. Who else was with him in the ark? Well, 7 of every clean animal, go back to chapter 7 and you can read that, of his male and his female, and 2 of every unclean animal of its male and its female, and they went into the ark. Now people will quibble about, well, what about the insects and so on? Well, God made it a way for them to continue to exist or become extinct during this time frame of the flood. So everything that was with Noah would be able to continue on this earth, and everything that wasn't with Noah would perish from the flood. So let's understand that as we press on and talking about the fossil record, the earth's mightiest evidence that God exists, and evidence that a global flood is what we see in this earth as proof of God and his sending of the flood. So we ask this question, does the fossil record support evolution or creation? You were probably taught in school, which many of you will remember these days. Some of you are old enough where it wasn't in schools yet, but many of you probably, and if you have taken classes recently of any sort of science or anything of that nature, you've been taught that evolution is the answer to our history, our human history, our Earth's history, and our universe's history. Well, does the fossil record prove that evolution is true? The reason why many people are stuck on the fossil record is because it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see animals that existed before us. It's fascinating to see things that one time walked on this earth, one time lived on this earth, and we can see some great massive creatures, and we can see some very small creatures. But yet we still live with a lot of great creatures, don't we? We live with really the largest animal that we've ever seen on this earth. Now, there are speculations about certain animals, like the megalodons and so on, and we've seen some big teeth that come up, and they try to then superimpose a body around those big teeth, and we really just don't know exactly because we don't have certain fossils to be able to prove speculations that many people have come up with. But yet we do have massive creatures, and one of those massive creatures that's the biggest we've ever seen still lives today. It's the blue whale. It's huge. It's massive. It's a big animal. When you talk about big creatures, we still live with many of them. When you talk about terrorizing or frightful creatures, we still live with many of them. And so we're no different than if we lived with dinosaurs. People say, well, man could have never lived with dinosaurs. Why not? We train some of the most fiercest beasts out there. Why wouldn't we be able to train dinosaurs? Why would they be any different than any other animal that God gave man the dominion over? So, does the fossil record support evolution or creation? Evolution predicts this. Now notice what it says. It's the prediction. This is the hypothesis that is being brought forth. That single-cell organisms at the bottom of the fossil record, followed by fossils, then would come fossils of other simple organisms. That is, we should see a consistent trait of lesser beings, lesser organisms, to more complex as we go up in the strata of the fossil record. They say that billions of intermediary transitional fossils would be in existence for every subsequent species. That is, anything that exists, we should be able to see billions of transitionary fossils, changes within the kinds and the species and the traits and so on. We should be able to see this all throughout the fossil record. And then they also say inevitable extinctions as a result of what they consider is survival of the fittest. So these are evolution's predictions. Now a creationist comes in that believes in God, believes in the Word of God, and believes what God has said concerning these things to be able to say, do we see the evidence of a global flood or yet God's hand in the record, the fossil record particularly? Well, the creationists would predict that a record of death from the flood, not a record of evolving life. Do we see massive graves of death of animals and even humans across this planet coming from a catastrophic event? Okay, another prediction would be that few fossils would be below the flood layers of strata. That is, all the strata that we see, do we see any fossils below the flood layers? Because what puts down strata? It's water. You need water to put down those layers. When you look at the Grand Canyon, any geologist that's worth his snuff and that's going to be honest, any geologist will tell you that's not it being carved out by millions of years by the Colorado River. It's been laid down through strata. It is laid down because water was above it, laying down those stratas that we see today with our eyes. A creationist will also predict that flood layers would be a record of worldwide destruction. Mentioned that a moment ago. The explosion of fully formed and functional fossils. What kind of fossils do we see? Do we see transitionary fossils, or do we see fully functional animals and all kinds of animals as fossilized creatures beginning in the flood layers with no evidence of prior evolution? Remember that last point, with no evidence of prior evolution. We also see here that most fossils would be in sedimentary rock, since the flood was an aqueous event. Aqueous just meaning it was dealing with water. That's all that means. It's simply saying it was an event with water. That's what the flood was. And then also a creationist would predict that simple and complex creatures would be mixed throughout the fossil record. There wouldn't be this layering of simple organisms all the way up to more complex. We would see simple and complex mixed throughout the fossil record. Larger, faster, smarter creatures might be found higher in the record, and we'll talk about that as we go through here. There's also a few more points they had mentioned, that creatures at the base of the record would be those found on the ocean floor, followed by marine creatures moving further and further inland. This is basically meaning that when you have a global flood and the waters, as they recede down, those creatures that were in the ocean are going to stay in the ocean. Those bottom feeders are going to stay at the bottom, and there would be some that would have risen up with the flood levels, and they would have then laid themselves or been laid down on land. And we should be able to see the evidence of those marine creatures that live at the bottom. We're talking so low that we as humans cannot handle the pressure. When we can't even go down that low. We have to send what we now have the technology to do, robots and cameras, to be able to go down so far to see these marine creatures that we had no idea existed before. And yet what we'll find is actually we see those marine creatures that we can't even go and see at the bottom of the ocean. We find them all in inland places across the world on land. Absolutely amazing. How else would they get there unless those waters rose up, and as those waters came down, they laid themselves on the land, and of course subsequently died from that and fossilized as they were covered by sediment. Marine fossils will be found throughout the record. Obviously, this is going to exist. We will find marine fossils intermixed with all kinds of inland fossils, all kinds of fossils of the beast of the field, all kinds of human remains. We'll find marine fossils all mixed in the fossil record. And post-flood extinctions would often be found in the record. There would be animals that would become extinct, that would not continue on very long past the flood time. We would see that also in the fossil record. Fossils and flood layers would show no change in evolution. They would just be what they are, and that's what they are. No change from before and no change after. They died what they were because they died as they were made from God's hand as they were. And post-flood layers would show evidence of the diversifying of creatures after they left the ark to repopulate the earth. I know some people, when they look at this and say, all those creatures fit on the ark, and some of you have been to Kentucky and seen kind of an imagined version of the dimensions of an ark. Now, we don't know exactly how the ark was constructed. We don't know the exact shape of it, but we know the dimensions. We know how tall it was, we know how long it was, we know how wide it was, we know how many floors were on it, we know how many windows, we know how many doors, we know there was a covering over the top, we know it was a large structure. And there would be no problem fitting the population of the animal kind on that structure. But yet they left the ark and repopulated the earth. And so what we see is three characteristics in the fossil record. We see number one, which we'll talk heavily on, they put a lot of heavy emphasis upon this, the abrupt appearance. That is, all of a sudden we just see fully formed creatures in the fossil record. We don't see half-formed, we don't see mixing of forms, we see fully formed creatures. And when we see those fully formed creatures, we see a stasis, we see a continuation, we see them living for some time in the fossil record, and then we may even see an extinction. Some of those animals, some of those insects, some of those marine kinds, we think may have become extinct. What we'll actually see tonight is that some of them didn't become extinct. We thought they were, but we're actually still living with fossils today that are still living. That's kind of neat, and I'll look at those here in a minute. But there are some that did go extinct. And there are some that we don't live with anymore today. We're not seeing what people will call T-Rex or Tyrannosaurus Rex walking around any place on the earth. I'm sure if we have seen one today, and I'm sure if people have, there'd be video of it all over the place. It's kind of like when people use their ideas of UFOs, and they try to convince us that these things are real. Well, if they're so real, why is every video of any kind of UFO constantly blurring and constantly never able to make out exactly what it is? And think about the technology in your hands right now. Some of you have better cameras on your phones than what a camera actually is by itself. I know on some of the cameras that you could point it right here and go a half a mile down the street and have a perfectly clear picture of a sign down the street. And yet, how come we can't get a clear picture of a UFO? But that's a different point. I'm trying to tell you, though, if a T-Rex existed, wouldn't we see it? We know that's extinct. But there are other animals that we thought were extinct, or some scientists say were extinct, that actually aren't. And we actually will find them in our animal kingdom today. So what do we see in the fossil record? Number one, characteristic is that it is an abrupt appearance. An abrupt appearance. That is, we just see animals. We just see them in the fossil record. We don't see anything before them. We just see them existing. When fossils first appear in the fossil record, they appear fully formed without any so-called evolutionary history. This is important. And if anyone wants to defend an evolutionary history, ask them this question. How come every fossil is fully formed to what it is and what it always has been? That's where you need to begin when you start to have a discussion about the fossil record with someone who says that God doesn't exist, the flood didn't exist, these are all fairy tales and God is just made up, and yet evolution is our answer to who we are and why we are here and what we are seeing. Ask them that question. How come when we see fossils we never see a transitionary state? Oh, but you have probably heard in the last 50 years or so, you've heard of things like Lucy. You've heard of fossils that supposedly were the missing link in the transition and so on. Do you realize that the so-called fossil of Lucy, who was the missing link for our kind, humankind, from the transition from where we changed from? Because remember, we are not from apes, we are just from the common ancestor of apes. That's what evolutionary scientists teach. We're just from a common ancestor. So they supposedly found a common ancestor with one small bone, then made up a whole computerized CGI image from one bone, and then took bones that they found distances apart from that one bone and tried to create something together and say this is our evolutionary ancestor, and we have now found a transitionary fossil. False. We have not. There are still people trying to use that ideology, but many a scientist will not go back to that kind of thought because they know they cannot prove within that kind of false assumption in their lives, not in their lives, but in their studies and in their education as they teach. Here's a few statements. We'll see several statements from folks, and this is from the University of Texas at Austin, talking about this explosion of fossils and fully formed creatures. This rapid diversification, known as the Cambrian explosion, puzzled Charles Darwin and remains one of the biggest questions in animal evolution to this day. Cambrian explosion. I want to define that for you. The Cambrian explosion is the time frame when many kinds of invertebrates, that are those who do not have like backbones, that's invertebrates, and the first vertebrates. Just invertebrates. The time when many kinds of invertebrates and the first invertebrate fishes appeared in the fossil record. All of a sudden, the Cambrian explosion, supposedly, is when we see all of these invertebrates. We see all kinds of marine animals existing. All kinds of fish and all kinds of things like crabfish and what we know of as trilobites. We'll talk about those here in a minute. A trilobite, basically a small creature of many different sizes, but a trilobite would typically be in marine areas and at the bottoms of oceans and seas and so on. And they would be all around, all over the place, thousands and thousands of them. And yet what they're saying here is that nothing before that can be affirmed as anything coming into why did they appear? Why did these fish appear? Why did these trilobites appear? Why did these invertebrates appear? They just came out of nowhere. That's what we see in the fossil record. They just exist. They just exist. We see no evidence of billions and billions of subsequent lesser beings of those invertebrates coming up into what they were in the Cambrian period. We see none of that. All we see is them existing. We see them existing. American scientist says, as Darwin noted in The Origin of Species, which, by the way, The Origin of Species has done more hurt to our civilizations across this earth than it ever did of anything good. There are some things that came good out of it. When it comes to him acknowledging Darwin, acknowledging that there are variations in kinds, like the birds, the finches that he looked at, they had different beaks. That doesn't mean that they came from different animals or different beings. And it's the diversification that exists just like us as humans. We all have different beaks too. I'm using our noses as a beak. You know, isn't it funny? Have you ever done this with your children? You ask yourself, well, whose nose do you have? You know, oh, they got dad's nose, or they've got mom's nose. We all look different, but we all have very similar features. Those finches were all finches. They weren't anything different. Just because their beaks were different in adaptation based upon how they mated with different finches over the time frame. Guys, it's so elementary to look at the differences in each kind and to know they're still the same kind. Humans will always be humankind. Snakes will always be snake kind. You get what I'm saying? So as Darwin noted in The Origin of Species, the abrupt emergence of arthropods in the fossil record during the Cambrian presents a problem for evolutionary biology. Guys, this was in 1997, this says. It presents a problem. Now, do you think this problem is presented to our children in schools? No, it is not. It's presented as fact, everyone. This is why we're having such a big problem in our society with the godlessness in mind, is because these things are presented as fact. Fact of evolution, fact of biology, fact of science, fact of history. So they're never bringing up these actual thoughts that scientists are saying that they can't answer. But unfortunately, those same scientists are trying to draw a conclusion where they haven't even drawn one themselves. American scientists also, from this gentleman, said there are no obvious, simpler, or intermediate forms, either living in the fossil record, that show convincingly how modern arthropods evolved from worm-like ancestors. Nothing out there. It's obvious, it's even said here. And consequently, there has been a wealth of speculation and contention. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of scientists who are going to be arguing about this explosion in the Cambrian period, where all of a sudden we have fully formed, fully functional invertebrates and arthropods living on this earth with no evidence, none of any evolutionary history before them. Stephen Jay Gould, just to let you know who this man is. He's an American paleontologist. He's an evolutionary biologist, and he's a historian of science. He was an influential speaker. He was an influential scientist, widely read, and he was an author of many popular science books. He says, back in 1994, the Cambrian explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life. Now remember, they're taking an evolutionary perspective of this. So they're saying back, 300 million years ago, whatever it was, they're saying that this blows our mind on how remarkable the Cambrian explosion was, to see all these fully formed creatures with no evolutionary past. Richard Dawkins, a British evolutionary biologist and author, he's probably one you've heard many times. He likes to get into debates, and they're very notable debates. You can go on YouTube and see him debating all kinds of religious personalities existing out there that are trying to prove God and the Bible. And he is a very well-spoken man, a very heated man when he gets speaking. But in his well-speaking, he can fool a lot of people because he can use the English language very well, and unfortunately, very falsely. But he says here, truthfully, the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, I was off only about 300 million, so that's all right, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear. Notice how sly that wording is. Listen to that wording again. In which we find most of the major invertebrate groups, and we find many of them. So he's saying there could be still some that we don't find. Already, though, in an advanced state of evolution, the very first time they appear. You see, right there, it's a contradictory statement. If it's the first time they appear, well, they're appearing fully formed, not from evolution. He also says it is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. What do you do with evidence? You go where the evidence should draw you. You should not go where your theory takes you. Let me put a scriptural application here. There are a lot of religious dogmas out there about what you need to do to be a Christian or to be saved, but God has only given us His Word. When He said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved, and he that believes not shall be condemned," I'm going to believe Christ. I'm not going to believe somebody's theology about God's Word. I'm going to believe what God's Word says. What He has done is believe the theology of evolution, because that's what it is. It's a religion. They believe the theology of evolution before the evidence. You see what I'm saying? Here's the evidence Christ gave us to become a Christian. And yet too many people follow after their own theories, their own thoughts, and yet still will not yield to the truth. As he, to this day, 82 years old, I believe he is, still has not yielded to that truth. George Gaylord Simpson, he's an American paleontologist. Just so you know, a paleontologist is someone who studies a fossilized past. That's all it means. Someone who studies fossils. George Gaylord Simpson, and these three men are very notable within this field. Most new species, genera, and families are nearly all categories above the level of families appear in the record suddenly and are not led up to by known, gradual, completely transitional sequences. Basically, all he is saying is the same thing. We don't see anything bringing us to the Cambrian period. We only see the Cambrian period existing. So it happened abruptly. It was an abrupt time, and it was a complex time. Just so you know, I mentioned the trilobites here just a moment ago. A trilobite, let me pull down my notes here real quick here. A trilobite was a very complex organism. They still say about the trilobite that it had the most complex eye and lens than even what we see today of other organisms. This is not a single-celled, simple organism that just kind of brought itself into this goo that we see, and it formed itself and made itself into this complexity that it is. A trilobite, as they say, lived 600 million years ago, was a complex organism. There were some that were about a foot large. There were some that were just a couple inches. But they're everywhere. We see millions of fossilized trilobites across this earth. They are marine creatures, but we find them all over, even, or as I mentioned a moment ago, the inland areas of the planet. There's actually a picture that exists, and it's been widely known for several years now, several decades, of a fossilized footprint from a sandal of a man, and in both sandal imprints, one is in the top left corner and the bottom is the bottom right of the heel, trilobites that were stepped on, fossilized into the imprint. That's still very popular to be able to for people to look at to say, could they have possibly existed at the same time as human beings? Yes, they could. Absolutely they could. But yet we're told that these creatures lived millions upon millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. But we're not going to spend much more time on trilobites. Let's continue on with this. Evolution predicts that diversity would precede disparity. Now, that's basically what this means. Now, let's define this. Diversity means a variety of things. Variety of things would come before disparity. That means differences, or noticeable and significant differences. Okay? So this is how an evolutionary perspective would look, is that you would have something that would come off of a single ancestor, then everything would branch off from there. From a creationist model, when we know that God has made everything by its kind, you would have certain kinds, like let's say this was the horse kind, this was the bear kind, this was the dog kind, and then everything branches off from there. Because God made everything according to its kind. It's interesting when we see that, when we talk about that, is that we always, and will continue to know, and it's never changed in any kind of scientific knowledge of any sort, horses always come from horses. Bears always come from bears. Giraffes come from giraffes. Dogs come from dogs. Cats come from cats. And what's amazing is the variations that can come within those kinds. That's what we're seeing here. This is the variations. Because if you take just a simple house cat, did you know it has the same genetic principles as a tiger and a lion and other kinds of cats in the cat family? And I know that's a simple one to be able to recognize, but remember, God made everything according to its kind. But evolution tries to say that all these kinds have come from the one simple single-cell organism that then sprouted all these different kinds. It's a big difference. It's a big difference. There are people who are trying to mix evolution with creation and trying to add millions and millions of years in day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and so on. But you can't get past this because God said He made everything in its own kind. So they have to be made as they were. Cats as they were, dogs as they were, and so on. How many different kinds of cats did Noah need on the ark to be able to continue the population of the cat kind? The amount is 7 if they were of the clean, of the male and female, or 2 if they were the unclean of the male and female. And did you know genetically, just about 5 years ago, I came up, and I didn't put this in my notes, I wish I would have now that I'm bringing it up, but genetically, they've done so many wonders with genetics over these last several decades. And we're getting more and more knowledge about genetics and understanding who we are in our genetics and why we're able to do certain things when we reproduce. And this, like why some people will have certain complications and other people won't have because of our genes and so on. But what we have found in actually the genetics of the animal kind is that particularly a giraffe, I mentioned a giraffe a moment ago, you don't need the different types of giraffes that we see today that exist, even though there's not many like it is in the cat kind. But the point being is that you only need about, what they came to is about 10. Think about it, about 10 to be able to populate what we see today. And that includes everything that we know of genetically, like your elephants, your dogs, your major animals that exist on this earth. You only need about 10. Now think about that. That actually fits what Genesis chapter 6 says and Genesis chapter 7. If God said there's 7 of every clean, and I know there are people that will argue back and forth, but 7 of every clean, that means it's male and it's female. That equals how many of the clean? 14 going into the ark 2 by 2. And if there's 2 of every unclean, it's male and female. That means there's 4 going in 2 by 2 into the ark. And so what you see there is that number 14 and 4 is kind of right in the middle of what we've come genetically of 10. That's fascinating, guys. That's absolutely fascinating that we've come to that conclusion and God had already said it before we even had that kind of knowledge. And all you need is just a few to be able to produce the differences and the variations that we see today in the amount of years. So creation would put this back the opposite. And this is, I just want you to also understand this. God's ways are always opposite than man's ways. If you've ever studied the book of Revelation, and you go into Revelation chapter 20, do you remember all those stones that were mentioned, all those types of well, they weren't stones. Revelation chapter 20. You know all the Greek mythology and the Greek way of thinking? When chapter 21, when they're talking about the foundations of the wall, jasper, sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, sardonyx, and so on, that order is actually opposite than the way man put that order. It's the exact opposite. And it's one of those things that some people have said, is that John, through the inspired writer, John showing us that God's ways is the exact opposite of man's ways. Well, in essence, creation would predict that disparity would precede diversity. So, the characteristic number 2 is that we see of stasis, that is a continuation. After creatures appear in the fossil record, they remain virtually the same throughout the rock layers. A T-Rex stayed a T-Rex. A kangaroo stayed a kangaroo. A dog stayed a dog. Oh, but a saber-toothed tiger, nope, still in the family of tigers. He just happened to have some longer teeth than the tigers that exist today. They stay the same throughout. So Stephen Jay Gould, he's admitted that evolutionists have no direct evidence for smooth transitions from one to another. No direct evidence. But they'll tell you evolution is true. Isn't that fascinating? They will talk out of both sides of their mouth. When they look at the fossil record and know what they're teaching is wrong and know what they're believing is wrong, and they'll come right out on the other side of the mouth and say, you need to believe in evolution as fact. And if you don't, you're believing in a spaghetti monster god, another gentleman who always says that. I forget his name. Anyway, he also said all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. Little. Precious little. And of course, that precious little, as I gave you an example, comes from somebody taking one bone and saying, this is our transitionary fossil. He also says the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. It's a consistent and nagging problem, and it will always be a consistent and nagging problem. And don't let any scientist, any paleontologist, any evolutionist say, well, we're just learning more as we go on. So once we find ourselves wrong, we'll just change our way of thinking. You know what? They've been saying that for years and years and years and years, and they're continuing to indoctrinate our children year after year after year after year, and teaching them that they are godless, teaching them that there is no God, and teaching them that they have no value because you came from nothing. And therefore, if you come from nothing, what have I said previously? That means you are nothing. And that's false. That is wrong. We are something in God's eyes because we came from Him, His very breath, His very image we are made in. He also said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. Well, it's not a secret anymore, is it? He also says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference. Inference. Definition. A conclusion reached on the basis of the evidence and reasoning from. Are you sure? Are you sure you've reached the right conclusion? Are you sure you've came to the right reasoning within your mind about the evidence that you're seeing? You see, they're not. Their inference is wrong because they want to believe in a godless state. However reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Okay, then stop using fossils as your evolutionary evidence. Stop it. Knock it off. Stephen Stanley, in this book on page 39, he said the known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution. Phyletic evolution just means a slow, uniform, or gradual change. That's all he's meaning. The fossil record fails to document a single example of slow, uniform, gradual change, accomplishing a major morphological transition, and hence offers no evidence that the gradualistic model can be valid. Robert Barnes, University of Oxford, says the fossil record tells us almost nothing about the evolutionary origin of phyla and classes. Intermediate forms are non-existent, undiscovered, and not recognized. Phyla just meaning a primary grouping consisting of animals constructed on a similar general plan and thought to be evolutionarily related. James Valentine and Douglas Irwin said if ever we were to expect to find ancestors to or intermediaries between higher taxa meaning a taxonomy, defines groupings of biological organisms based on their shared characteristics, it would be in the rocks of the late Precambrian to Ordovician times when the bulk of the world's higher animal taxa evolved. Well, they also said yet transitional alliances are unknown, they're unconfirmed, for any of the phyla or classes appearing in them. It doesn't exist. What we see in the fossil record is an animal that exists as the animal that it is and only that it is. We do not see transitional anythings. We see something that already is. Mark Ridley, University of Oxford, also says no real evolutionist, whether gradualistic or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of evolution as opposed to special creation. Well, fortunately, there are some who do, and obviously I understand the way he's approaching that statement. So why? Why, if you use the fossil record the way the fossil record actually shows us, it actually supports creation and not evolution. That's what it actually does. Charles Darwin actually says the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Thanks you for saying something correct, Mr. Charles Darwin. Thank you for being obvious, or making an obvious statement to an obvious conclusion that obviously exists. You don't see this. It doesn't exist. You know, I wonder why Charles Darwin wrote what he did. It just started, if you want to say, that slippery slope. It just started one thing after another. But I have to say, it has to be the hand of the devil. It has to be the hand of Satan. He couldn't get some people in one area, so he's got to get them on another area. And hey, let's just take God out of the picture, and let's just use what God has laid down for us in the flood. And let's just use the fossil evidence, and let's just confuse the matter. Let's make it more difficult. He even says, geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory. Do you see they're still doing the same thing today as Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins? They're saying one thing and then saying another thing. They're speaking out of both sides of their mouths. Colin Patterson, as he wrote, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Can you draw out for us what the transitionary fossil looked like? You know, take the example that we have over here and give us an illustration of it. You see, every illustration that has ever existed of some so-called transitionary fossil has been made up in the mind of man. They cannot go to anything with substance and anything that has evidence and say, all I'm doing is drawing what I see right here. They can't draw what they see. So any kind of drawing that has existed of any illustration of a transitionary fossil is false. It's just made up. Yet Stephen Jay Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. It doesn't exist. What we see is what already existed, what already is, what already was. Here's what's interesting. Vertebrates, fossils, that is those with bones, like ours, backbones and so on. The fossil record only has about 0.0125%. There's not many vertebrate fossils out there. We're made to think that there are a lot. But when it comes to invertebrate fossils, there's 99.9% of the fossil record that we have on record is through invertebrates. Why is that? Well, do you realize that we still live with what we're thought of as fossils? I want you to consider this fish right here. Pretty neat looking fish, a lot of fins on it, right? And I do, since we're doing a lot of the Apologetics Press stuff, I want to go ahead and read from Kyle Button, Eric Lyon's book. It's a book that's meant for children, high school age, and so on. And I do recommend it. The Truth Be Told: Exposing the Myth of Evolution. I do like what they say about this fish, the coelacanth. Listen to what they said. For decades, evolutionists taught that the coelacanth became extinct about the same time dinosaurs did, supposedly 65 million years ago. In the past, it was said that these fish gradually developed legs and began to live on land, and then sometime later became extinct. So that fish was taught for many years that it was extinct 65 million years ago, so we wouldn't see any of them around today, and it grew itself legs. Of course, where's the fossils for that? We should be able to see dead fossils of some point where that fish had legs of some transition, right? How big are the legs when it first comes out? I mean, is he wear a size 10 shoe? I don't know. Okay, sorry. Bad joke. Let me keep going. Evolutionists thought that these fish were the missing link between certain water and land animals. Similar to the ape-like creatures that allegedly evolved into humans, these fish were said to have evolved into land animals millions of years ago. In fact, evolutionary scientists use the coelacanth as a part of their index fossil system, meaning that any rocks that contain coelacanth fossils were considered to be at least 65 million years old. Remember, that's an assumption made. Because one assumption has been made, that means that then all assumptions have to be made off of that. Now, is that logical reasoning? No, it's not. Anyway, let's keep going on. With other fossils in those rocks assumed to be that old as well. Until 1938, evolutionists believed that men and coelacanths could not possibly have lived at the same time. These creatures were known only from the fossils that evolutionists claimed were millions of years old. But then, on December 24th, 1938, listen to it, it's a date in a year that's very specific, the scientific world was rocked when an unidentified fish, 5 feet long, weighing over 100 pounds, was brought to shore in South Africa. It was caught in the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. The fishermen who netted the fish, having no idea what the creature's proper name was, called it the great sea lizard because its pectoral fins looked more like little fringed legs. So it's a different looking fish, isn't it? How many fish do you see have fins that are down below like that? Not very many. One scientist examined this strange creature. However, they confirmed what formerly was thought impossible. A coelacanth had been caught in modern times. One evolutionist said that he could not have been more surprised if he had come across a living dinosaur. After all, according to their theory, coelacanths evolved before dinosaurs and became extinct about the same time as dinosaurs. Since 1938, over 100 coelacanths have been caught. We're not talking about just one that all of a sudden popped up and everybody's saying, oh, look at this one, and we'll use that one then as our logic and as it continues on. Over 100 have been caught. In 1952, they were seen swimming near the Comoro Islands in the Indian Ocean. Another population was found in 1998 off the coast of Indonesia. Surprisingly, local Indonesian fishermen were quite familiar with this fish, having been catching them for years, though scientists were totally unaware they lived in that region. Do you know how many times we have thought that certain insects have become extinct? And do you realize we'll find an island somewhere off a coast of African nations and the continent of Africa or the South American continent, and all of a sudden we'll find that little spider again. We'll find that crab. There was a particular crab that the same thing was thought to be extinct, but now they found it again. You know, it's amazing what we as humans think we know, and the assumptions that we will then make. And then say in those assumptions that we are right concerning the entire population and traversing the entire world of like we've been there. Like we've been able to be at every single place in every single part of the world. Think about the audacity that takes as a human being to say that I know 100% for sure that this animal is fully extinct and doesn't exist in our lifetime because it's 65 million years old. You know, I wish these scientists that said that at one time would actually repent and say, we were wrong. You can't do that, though, because if you start saying you're wrong, people will actually start questioning how wrong you were or if you were ever right in the first place. Modern-day coelacanths look like their fossil counterparts, which are mistakenly dated as being millions of years old. The fact that these modern-day creatures have stayed the same as their fossilized ancestors is no surprise to Christians. The Bible teaches that animals produce after their kind. Genesis 1, 22 and 24. All right, so that's one example. They give several other examples, but we don't have time to go into those. Here are some of the examples that are still living, that we still see today. Obviously, we can't go through all of them, but here's what's interesting. Crocodiles. Over supposedly 150 million years old, and they supposedly have been able to traverse evolution without much change. That's amazing. That's amazing. So anyway, there's a huge list, and we could take some time going in that. But number 3, the characteristic of the fossil records, we would have to see extinction. Mass extinctions, such as would suggest worldwide catastrophic phenomena, appear in the fossil record. There are 5 mass extinctions that evolutionists will teach. They will teach that these 5 mass extinctions show the majority, if not all, like this one, 95% of Earth species went extinct in the Permian extinction 252 million years ago. Well, I mean, if you really put it in perspective, Earth has had a hard time coming to what we are today. They've been going up and down to almost full extinction and bringing back a fullness of life across the earth and taking it all away again. 70+% in the majorities, except this one estimate about 60%, but that's still above 50%. Those are pretty good odds that the majority has become extinct, or so evolutionists would say. So, causes according to evolution is unknown. Why did these extinctions happen? Unknown. Unknown. Some people say, well, there were asteroid attacks. You know, you've probably heard of the great big asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. You know, you don't hear as much today about the big dust cloud that flew up and supposedly blocked the sun, in which the dinosaurs weren't able to get the vegetation and nutrition that those types of, what do they call that eat vegetation? Well, that's what it needs, photosynthesis, but what kind of animal is it that just eats? Herbivores, thank you, herbivore. So they wouldn't be able to eat these things, and so the sun was blocking them. Photosynthesis was going to happen. The herbivores then would become extinct. Well, what would happen if they died on top of the land? What would happen? Their bodies would decay. Scavengers would come and eat them. No fossils would be made. Fossils only come from a quick burial of an animal in which oxygen is taken out of the picture immediately and quickly. It comes from a burial. It doesn't come from them just falling on the ground and dying. Animals will decay and animals will be eaten, and they will not fossilize in that case. So you don't hear about that as much. You still hear about the asteroid attack, but you don't hear about the dust cloud as much. So, of course, these causes are unknown. When we think about the geological column of what we see, that is, when we see organisms on a lower state, we have to understand that when they talk about Precambrian, when they talk about Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, that is, these time frames in which some of these animals would live, understand this fits directly and completely in with the time frame of creation to the biblical flood time, in which the Cambrian explosion, the trilobites and the brachiopods and the amphibians and reptiles and so on, which we see across this entire earth. I want you to notice something that I took by sheer chance. Some of you probably use eSword as little references when you're doing some scripture study and such. eSword says back in Genesis chapter 7, about verse 23, they say that every living substance that is referred to, all creatures that died, the most incontestable evidence has been afforded of the universality of this fact. The moose deer, a native of America, has been found buried in Ireland, fossilized. Elephants, native of Asia and Africa, fossilized in the midst of England. Crocodiles, natives of the Nile in the heart of Germany, and shellfish never known in any part except the American seas, the areas around our continent, with the entire skeletons of also whales in the most inland parts of England. How does that happen? Water brought them up, and water brought them down. And God was no respecter of animals when it came down. It came down where it came down. We find all kinds of marine fossils on land and all kinds of land fossils in marine areas. We find more marine fossils on land. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Continue on. The cause according to creation is the flood. That's actually the last slide. I made it. Or did the bell ring and I just missed it? It did ring. The second one? Oh, I did make it. I did make it. Okay, are we ending in a prayer? Is that? Okay, let's pray together. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful, Lord, for this time to be together, and thankful, Father, that you have given us your word, showing us that you have created all things, that the fossil record shows your creation, that you made all things the way they are, that you made all the dinosaurs in their greatness and their glory. You made all the sea creatures in their awesome and majestic nature of what they do, and we know that all the beasts of the field, but we're so thankful, Father, you made us. You made us in your image so that we may know you and that we can look at the things around that we have seen and glorify your name. Father, help us to glorify you even with the fossil record, knowing that the flood changed everything on this earth, that you destroyed all living things, every creature that creeps, everything that's in the seas, everything that flies in the air, everything was destroyed except for those who were in the ark. Help us to remember that as you gave us the ark as the example, that's that example that Peter gave us in 1 Peter 3. Help us to remember, Lord, that we need to be in the ark of your Son, that we need to be saved through him, and that we can be saved. And help us, Father, to know that more than 8 souls will be saved, not by the water of the world, but by the blood of your Son. even though we utilize the water for baptism so that we can be in the likeness of your Son's death, burial, and resurrection. Thank you for the remission of sins that we have through his name. Father, we thank you for this time, this VBS that we're able to have this week. We pray, Father, that many of our young children will hear you, will see you, will know you through your creation, and will be able to believe you as they grow, and help us as parents and grandparents, and help us as the church to identify when they are being taught wrong, whether it's through school or friends or family or anyone they come across, and help us to help them to be prepared and to be ready to face the challenges that they will be faced with when it comes to our society that believes that you don't exist. Help us, Father, to always believe in you and put our trust in you.